Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update. My name is Tom Ayers. I'm the senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock. And my guest, as always, is Representative Charlie Kimbell of Woodstock, also representing Plymouth and Reading in the state legislature. Hi, Charlie.
Morning, Tom. Great to see you again.
Well, it's been quite a week. It's been quite a session of the legislature, and we come to this. We've been talking about education transformation for much of the session and much of these weekly get-togethers here on Legislative Update. On Friday, things really came to a dramatic impasse between the Senate and the House versions of the Education Transformation Act. Can you give us a little bit of a distillation, as simply as you can, of what the conflict between the Senate and the House versions is all about and where things stand?
Sure. Part of it is trying to understand how the legislature wraps up its session and how the end of session things usually happen. When there's a big difference of policy between the House and the Senate, they enter these conferences of committees of conference. We talked about that the last time we met,
Mm-hmm.
and with a deadline looming, and that really forces people into coming up with some kind of agreement and compromise. And that was thought to be in the cards between what the House and the Senate had both passed individually. The Senate had a difficult time coming up with their own proposal in response to the House's proposal for education transformation, spent all session doing it. And the Senate had, since the end of March, to really come up with its counter proposal, and it struggled to come up with one that they all agreed on. And in the waning days of their session, they then did advance a proposal to send back to the House that was a lot of it was mirrored on what the House had already passed. And there were many attempts to change that on the Senate floor, but it did not happen. So then when that came back to the House, they called for a committee of conference. They started meeting. And so there was great hope that they would be able to, in that end of session kind of rush, come up with a compromise. And it even looked promising on Wednesday night, even Thursday night, that they would be able to come up with a compromise. And then on Friday, things fell apart. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it fell apart because I'm not sure why, because they moved through some sections on governance and some other things that seemed to have agreement. But when it came down to finances, it all just fell apart. The Senate conferees came back with a proposal that was totally different than what the House had passed and then what the Senate had passed. That this is what we're proposing. And that's very atypical. That doesn't happen typically in a conference committee. You're
Yeah,
defending the position of the House that you're representing, whether it's House or the Senate. And
right.
so this is totally out of left field. And that really surprised the House conferees, and they didn't know where to go with it. And they were not able to come to an agreement on it. So they said, you know what? It's 11:30 at night on Friday night. We're not going to come to a compromise in the wee hours of the morning, certainly not one that we'll all be proud of and trying to take back to our constituents. And the bleary eyed reps and the bleary eyed senators were probably not at their best decision making time either.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they said, let's come back. Let's come back in what we have already scheduled for a veto session and June 16th and 17th. And let's figure out if we can come to a compromise then. So that's how we left it at 11:30 at night. People left trying to figure out, do I spend the night or do I just pack up my stuff and go home? And I
Mm-hmm.
decided I'd go pack up the stuff that I had in the dorm room where I'm staying and throw it in the truck and then come home and yeah, late night.
Are you able to distill without getting too deep into the weeds what the differences in the basic differences in the funding strategies are between the two packages? I know that's an extraordinarily complex question, and I'm not sure it can be easily, you know,
Yeah,
summarized.
yeah. There's two basic things. One is this foundation formula that was spoken about many times that the House had adopted. that came out of a cost factor approach developed by a professor at the University of Vermont and her colleague as to how to actually figure out how to pay what the base amount is and the weighted amount is. The foundation formula, the House is committed to that. And saying in 3 years, we want to use this foundation formula to pay for education in the state. The Senate came back and said, we don't believe that saves any money. Would like to totally change what the foundation formula looks like. We want to use these weights for students and not use the weights that came out of that. And so it was a totally different approach. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to reduce the amount of money that is going to be, some of it I can't even follow, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, all right, well, that's different. So it was really unpredictable. There was a lot more leeway given to private schools
Mm-hmm.
or independent schools, I should say, in the Senate proposal. There was also um, a greater allowance for independent schools, for instance, to have a lower share of their students having public monies paid into them. So it really opened that. So those are some of the points of contention.
Mm-hmm.
But really, and then there's a tradition, a transition of going from where we are now and how we fund education to what that future state looks like. And um, the Senate actually come up with an idea of how to do that, which was not a terrible idea. It actually looks pretty good. But in practice, like someone like Mountain View's school district, they're looking at the amount of money that came out of the of a spreadsheet that was saying if you applied this formula today, what would be the amount of money that you would receive, and compared to what you're currently receiving, it's a drastic difference. And but that's assuming that we don't save any money on special education before that formula foundation hits or foundation formula hits. And we know that special education costs have been doubling almost every year. So it's like there's some things that we have to address that are, driving up costs, healthcare costs. So we just passed some other legislation that's going to reduce healthcare costs. At least we hope so. So anyway, so those are some of the things
Yeah.
there.
So that goes to a question that has been somewhat confusing to me and in the public mind, and that's the question of timing.
Yeah,
When does all of this kick in, both from the foundation funding formula standpoint changes, and then the longer term issue of school construction funding, which of course is a hot button issue here in the Woodstock area and in the Mountain View School District. Um, there's there's been expressions of concern about this so-called $6 million shortfall that would happen
yeah,
under the current Senate funding formula, but it's not clear when that would happen,
yeah,
if it happened. And then there have been some increasing expressions of concern, including at the most recent meeting of the Woodstock Select Board last week on the part of school officials and board representatives about what the future may hold for Woodstock Union High School and Middle School as a physical facility if school consolidation were to dictate that possibly a new high school and middle school be built in Windsor or in Hartford or
mm.
somewhere else. So I'm conflating a bunch of issues here, I realize, but
yeah.
the timing of all of this is quite confusing to the public.
It is. You know, let's step back just a minute
Okay.
because the thing that started off all of the discussions from the governor's side was that we need to have lower costs in our education system because the property tax increase in 2024 and 25 were so high.
Hmm.
And then drop this plan in January to say, I'm going to reduce the number of school districts from 119 down to five. And then by doing that, we're going to have larger class sizes, which means some consolidation has to happen in order to achieve those. Um, but okay, well, that's a fine concept. in some ways. But how do you get from here to there? So this plan that the House came up with is a very deliberative plan and thoughtful. That's saying, okay, how are schools currently organized? What we don't want to do is just harm kids and the education that they receive for the sake of reducing property taxes. So let's figure out a thoughtful way to do it and not just come up with these five arbitrary districts. So even planning that, we came back with a proposal saying these are not going to be effective until the 2030 school year, which means beginning of 2029.
Wow. Okay.
And same with the changes in the foundation formula. So it gives time to figure out what does that school district look like? What does the new school district look like? So we created a board to really draw maps and come up with those maps. The Senate had a different construct as to who's on that board and how fast they have to deliver something. But we both have the same idea that we wanted that to be in December of this year in order to come back to in the next year to vote on what the school districts are. And this is not an easy process. I mean, that alone, to try to come up with what those new school district lines are, it's like the reapportionment for voting districts. It happens
Absolutely.
every, it takes a long time to figure out
Yeah.
based on the
Yeah.
census. So that's just one piece. I mean, the second piece is, once you have that, you have to elect new school boards. So when is that happening? So the timeline that we created, we needed to have a very detailed map of all the effective dates at which they could occur and when was it possible. So something simple, just by an example. We wanted the State Board of Education work with the Agency of Education to come up with one set of graduation requirements across the state because it varies by district right now. It's not the same.
Wow.
So we said, we want you to come up with one consistent graduation requirement. And they pushed back saying, well, by when? Like, well, all right. So the expectation we had, I think, was for 1 year, and it could be longer than that. Anyway, but they pushed back saying it's going to take us longer than that. The second one was we want the same school calendar across the entire state because that affects both the career and technical education centers and every school district as well. As to
Mhm.
when people are going to be able to, have school holidays, when the classrooms are in session, everything else. And they said, we need an extra year in order to plan that. So those things seem simple, but
Yeah.
then when you actually try to achieve them, there's reasons why people push back and say, no, you can't do it that fast. So even with all that, if you have new school districts, you come up with that, and then you say, all right, well, if we're going to have larger high school classes, where are those classrooms going to be? This is getting back to your question about like
Mhm.
Mountain Views and Windsor and Hartford. Where's the best location for a school? Is it the existing facilities? Maybe. Do they have to be new facilities? Maybe. So you have to answer those questions too. So there's a whole separate school construction task force set up to manage that. And that actually has survived both versions of the bill. So I'm very happy about that with the
Mhm.
state aid for school construction and the school construction. But then in terms of prioritizing what schools get built when, according to the priorities of the state, I tried to put in something that said any schools that have been previously approved by the Agency of Education would move to the front of the line for state aid for education. Well, that's fine, except there was really no approval by the state Agency of Education for schools. Woodstock or Mountain Views High School had previously been approved for their school construction costs to say, yes, we agree that these are reasonable costs up to
Mhm.
this dollar amount,
Mhm.
so that they would be exempt from the excess spending threshold.
Mhm.
Except that excess spending threshold was then taken out, or the exemption from excess spending was taken out by the legislature at the suggestion of the Joint Fiscal Office and others to make sure that no new schools were built while we're going through this transformation. But Colchester voted a $100 million school budget or school renovation package. so that they could renovate not only just one school, but many of their schools. You've got Burlington still going online.
Hmm.
Some school projects have come up for a vote, like the one in White River, the White River Academy up in South Royalton, which did
Hmm.
not pass. That failed. But
Multiple
anyway,
times.
multiple
Multiple times.
times. So you've got this obvious need for a new facility here in Woodstock. You've got all these problems happening to the school and Hartford around PCBs and other issues being discovered. So a large part of their school has to be closed off, classrooms closed off. So that's a priority. So what are you going to do in the meantime? Do you build a new school when the state aid for school construction hasn't yet really gone live and the new school districts have not gone live? So it's a really unsettled time for that. So the
Hmm.
timeline that has been proposed in the legislature to come up with this whole transformation is not only just effective in 2029, there's also the financial pieces of that for the foundation formula and are you going to have that transition
Hmm.
and finances because some schools right now don't get enough resources for what they should be spending on their children. Some get more than what that foundation formula may determine. And so if they have a decrease, well, you have to have a reasonable time period to then transition to a lower amount.
Hmm.
And in the meantime, you've got to figure out how can we actually better deliver special education services that are more effective and more efficient.
Hmm.
Um, and those are some of the things we got to address. So yeah, the timeline is critical.
Wow. So special education is a driver. What about technical education?
Technical education is, I mean, there's, the average expense for a student in the technical education center is north of $25,000. In some places, up to 30. There's
Wow.
one CTE center in the state that's $34,000 per student. And that's a lot of money. So,
Yes.
can you figure out a better way of delivering career and technical education? There are 17 centers around the state. Is there a way to more efficiently use them? There's some concept that some people would have about career and technical education being delivered inside of an existing high school. This idea of
Hmm.
a community school,
Hmm.
or there's another name for it, but that makes sense. I mean, I think that the kids that are in a high school that have a career and technical education center attached to it have a much better, an easier time of having a full education choice in front of them so that they can choose to go to an AP class that's offered in the high school, but also take some advanced technical education curriculum in the tech center that's attached to the high school. That's really great, but we
Hmm.
can't reproduce that everywhere around the state. I mean, there's only 17 of those centers across
Hmm.
Vermont, but there may be some other alternatives, and so there's a whole plan that came out last year about that. That's not really part of this whole education transformation plan. That's kicked off until a year from now. And so that's all part of that expense as well. And some of the Senate proposals around that. Yeah, it's very confusing.
Yeah. So core challenge here is reducing the burden on taxpayers. I mean, that's been a driving mechanism in this discussion all along. My understanding is that um, Governor Scott's objections to both the House and the Senate proposal are rooted in this whole issue of timing that you just touched upon, that he doesn't think um, either the Senate or the House proposal is moving aggressively enough timing wise. Is that correct?
I think he definitely wants it to move faster in order to achieve those cost savings faster.
Yeah.
But it in a lot of ways, and I agree with that to an extent. But you just don't want to do it in such a way that it destroys or the system that you've created or creates chaos. And then the people that are hurt by that are all the students, the 83,000 students that are enrolled in our public schools.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Ha
that's
has
not
the
good.
administration come up with its own detailed, concrete proposal for how it thinks we should move forward as a state?
Well, sure, in January, it did deliver the initial piece of its transformation plan, and then other pieces came with it. There are some holes that are missing, and the
Yeah,
timing is just really unrealistic. I mean, they said 5 school districts, but when you really look at it, like, how are you going to get there? And they've admitted, many of the folks within the administration have admitted that 5 was an initial proposal and
hmm,
that a larger number of districts would be acceptable and more realistic. So there's a lot involved with how one thing is proposed and what the expectation is as it comes out at the end. So, and in that process of trying to understand everything, just like the graduation requirements, just like the uniform calendar, things take longer than you would think.
hmm, hmm.
And so the governor wants to have more immediate cost savings. Great. Well, let's address the real cost drivers there. Um, so we've got the three basic cost drivers that are the biggest. Is you've got healthcare costs, which went up by 16% across the state for folks in the health in the
Right.
school system. And 80% of your costs are related to personnel that are employed in the school system,
Hmm,
between pay and benefits and everything else. And that 16% of increase in the healthcare costs is huge. That's
hmm.
one. A second is just looking at the number of adults we have per kid in the classroom. So it's not just the teacher student ratio, it's all the other ancillary services as well, where Vermont has the lowest uh, ratio of students per staff member in the country. So you have to address where can you move out of that? And there's two other things. But that's often because of class size, maybe because of class size. And that you can't really consolidate those classes that quickly by doing that. Um, a third thing is just looking at the number of buildings we have for the number of students we're trying to support. And we have a lot of buildings because of our rural nature.
Hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
and again, we come down to special education as a major cost driver. Um, and that is a necessary function to provide an education for all students, regardless of their abilities. And it's important that we provide that, but we have had escalating costs in special education. We've got a part in the bill, and that both the House and the Senate have agreed that that's something that we have to look at. I think in extraordinary costs last year, we had an increase of $70 million. Like,
Mm.
well, that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit of money.
What has been driving those special education costs well over and above general education costs?
Um, we try to make a transition from what was called the reimbursement model, where schools were reimbursed for education services they provided for students that are identified as having disabilities.
Hmm,
Um, and we changed from that to a census block, which would say instead of trying to micromanage what you're doing at the school level and trying to then get away from the idea of identifying more students that were eligible and then getting that higher reimbursement,
hmm,
to then saying, here's a pot of money that you can have based on the number of students you have in your school system. And you can apply both some intervention education and use that money more creatively to provide those services. There's all sorts of legal requirements, and I'm definitely going to get some of those terms wrong.
hmm.
But with the idea that it would be more efficient and it would be cheaper. Now, that particular act was never fully implemented, partly because of COVID, a large part because of COVID, and then because things just happened. So that could have resulted in that, but it really hasn't resulted in that. So that's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is that during COVID, we had a lot of stress on our kids, and a lot of mental health stress.
Mm-hmm.
And that was somewhat addressed by some federal monies that were brought into the schools to help staff up for that and deal with that. And that federal money's gone away.
Mm-hmm.
Rest is not.
Okay.
And so those mental health services are still necessary, and the school has to provide them. But that is not being funded by the federal government anymore. That's coming on the backs of taxpayers. So that's still a very real part of what's keeping our expenses high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so all that's to say, it's really complicated to say, let's just save money by reducing the number of school districts, which sure that would, but the just the swath of unintended consequences would be incredibly wide
Mm-hmm.
for the students. So you have to do it thoughtfully, carefully, and with a good plan.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the whole issue of parental and local control is woven all through this as well. Small towns, rural areas do not want to give up their local schools easily. Um, there's the whole issue of transporting students across broad, geographic expenses to regional schools, and the cost of that, not to mention the amount of time it takes out of each family's day for a
Yeah.
kid to get to a school. I'm making this up, but 20 miles away in each direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's an extraordinarily complex issue, without question.
It is, and the notion is to keep the early grades as close to home as possible.
Okay.
And the kids really benefit on a regional level when you get to middle and high school. And that's where you need a greater diversity of opportunities for students of that age.
Hmm.
And so, but it's still, even with, you get two small elementary schools that are fairly close to one another, what are you going to do there?
Right.
Um,
So,
so,
so the legislature is coming back together for this veto session, 2-day veto session, to reconsider all of these matters on June 16th and June 17th.
yes.
Uh, my understanding is that in the interim, you're using procedural methods in both the Senate and the House to forestall adjournment and keep in deliberations, but you won't actually all be gathering in Montpelier over the next week and a half,
No,
correct?
that's right. That's right. And it's important that technically we are not adjourned and we're just in recess for some various considerations as to what can happen. The Committee of Conference has not yet laid out a plan. The Committee of Conference for the Education Reform. I talked to by email with one of the conferees on the House side, and they don't yet have a schedule to meet with their counterparts in the Senate. I think that'll develop over the next few days as to what they can realistically do ahead of time, because to just go back to where they were on Friday in on June 16th may not be that productive.
How much interaction, I need to wrap this up, obviously, but how much interaction is there between these committees of conference and the governor's office so that the Scott administration's perspective is woven into, presumably the Republicans on the committees of conference are representing the administration's point of view to a large degree, I would think. But um, given the fact that Governor Scott waves the veto pen, um, what's to prevent something that comes out of the committees of conference in 10 days or 15 days, whatever it is, still not meeting muster with the governor?
Yeah, I'd say there's a concerted effort for all the conferees, not just the Republicans, to engage the governor and the administration to figure out what's acceptable to them. Because you don't want to come out empty-handed if you pass something and then to say, well, what was that for? So there's definitely an effort to do that. Even last week, in the waning days of the of last week, there was conversations going between the conferees and the governor. It's interesting. You'd think the Republicans on the committees would um, might espouse the governor's position. I don't think that was the case necessarily.
Mhm.
That on these committees of conference, or maybe not the House side,
Uh,
there is it becomes more local.
mhm.
It becomes more local in terms of how is this going to affect my school district?
Mhm. Mhm.
How is this going to affect my area of the state or the particular constituency I represent? So I think that's
Mhm.
the impasse right now. It's not, you would hope it would be the position of either the party, the caucus, or the body they represent. It's not that.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's the trouble is trying to
Yeah,
negotiate things
abs-
that have not been brought forth before.
absolutely. Well, Representative Charlie Kimball, you and your fellow lawmakers have your work continue to have your work cut out for you over the next 2 weeks or so,
Hmm.
in consultation with Governor Scott and his administration, and with one another through the conference committees. We'll continue as we have throughout this session to stay on top of it. See you again next week to catch up on how things are going, presumably, and then certainly 2 weeks hence, when those veto sessions are happening, we'll have much to wrap up in the wake of those. So um, I want to thank you for trying to distill down an extraordinarily complex education transformation issue into a way that the public can grasp it and that we can all grasp it as best we can. So thank you, and we'll see you again next week.
We're speaking to you again, Tom. All right,
All
thank
right.
you.
Take care.